Maria woke up to the sound of the city's hum, distant car horns, the chatter of early morning commuters, and the occasional clang of a garbage truck collecting its load. It was the same every day, a constant reminder that the world kept moving, even when she felt like her life had come to a standstill. Her small, one-room apartment was cluttered with the remnants of her former life, a life that felt like a distant memory now. A life full of ambition, hope, and promise. She once had it all. Friends, a job she loved, a beautiful home, and a marriage to Greg, a man she thought was her forever. But all that changed one fateful night. It was the night she found out that the man she had built a life with had been cheating on her for months. The revelation shattered her world. Greg, her husband, had chosen someone else over her, someone younger, someone more exciting, someone who wasn't her. In that moment, she felt like everything she had worked for, her career, her reputation, even her sense of self, had been torn away in an instant. She packed her bags that night, leaving the home they had shared together. It was the hardest decision she'd ever made, but it was one she had to make. The betrayal cut too deep, and Greg's hollow apologies only made it worse. She didn't even fight for the house or the things they had accumulated over the years. What was the point? Everything felt tainted by the memories of his lies. So she left. Months passed, and with each day, her world grew smaller. She bounced from one low-paying job to the next, each one slipping through her fingers like sand. Her savings dwindled, and soon she found herself without a roof over her head. Homelessness became her new reality. She would sleep on benches, in abandoned buildings, and occasionally find shelter in shelters, where the kindness of strangers was her only comfort. Her pride, once her armor, had been broken long ago, but she still held on to the hope that things could change. It was a crisp autumn morning when she received the letter. The envelope was thick, the kind that felt official. Maria opened it with shaky hands, unsure of what to expect. Inside, she found an invitation to a wedding. Greg's wedding. Her first instinct was to tear it up, to throw it away as if it never existed. But as she stared at the embossed gold letters, something inside her shifted. Why not go? Why not face the man who had destroyed her life? It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't even about trying to win him back. It was about closure. She needed to see him, to confront the person who had taken everything from her and left her to pick up the pieces. Maybe if she went, she would finally have the courage to let go of the past. Her decision wasn't made lightly. She spent the next few days preparing for the wedding, though she had nothing to wear. She couldn't show up in the same clothes she had been wearing for weeks. She scrounged together every bit of spare change she could find, and with some help from a local charity, she bought a simple, elegant dress from a second-hand store. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel human again. To feel like maybe, just maybe, she could regain some of the dignity that had been stripped away. The day of the wedding, Maria stood in front of the mirror, taking a long, hard look at herself. The woman who stared back was different from the one she remembered. She looked older, wearier, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. She wasn't the same woman who had cried herself to sleep in Greg's arms. She wasn't the woman who had been too afraid to stand up for herself. No, this was someone new, a woman who had learned to survive, who had learned to fight for what little she had left. She arrived at the wedding venue, a sprawling, opulent country club in the heart of the city, feeling like an intruder. The guests, all dressed in their finest, mingled with drinks in hand, chatting and laughing, as if they had no care in the world. It felt like a different world, a world she no longer belonged to. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Greg, now in a crisp suit, greeted his guests with a smile that was all too familiar. He was happy. He was starting a new life with Cassandra, the woman who had torn their marriage apart. And here she was, an outsider, a woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and the remnants of a broken heart. As Maria scanned the room, she couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here. Why had she agreed to come? To face him? To make a statement? She wasn't sure anymore. But what she did know was that this moment was hers. She had come this far, and now nothing would stop her from finding the closure she so desperately needed. She was an imposter at the wedding, no matter how much she tried to dress the part. Maria was aware of the whispers that followed her every step. She could see the looks of confusion and judgment from Greg's family and friends. They didn't know who she was or why she was there. They didn't know the pain she had suffered, the nights spent alone, trying to figure out how her life had unraveled so quickly. But they would. Greg's eyes locked with hers from across the room, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. He looked surprised, almost caught off guard. But that surprise quickly turned to discomfort as he realized who had entered his world again. She could see it in his face. Regret, guilt, and maybe even fear. The moment had arrived. Maria walked toward him, each step echoing in her mind. She was ready. Ready to speak her truth. Ready to confront the man who had broken her. As she reached the center of the room, all eyes turned to her. The music paused, and the guests fell silent. And just like that, Maria had everyone's attention. What happened next would change everything. And she knew that this was the moment that would define her future. She wasn't going to be the woman she once was, the woman who let things slide. No, today, she would reclaim her power, her voice, and maybe even, in some strange way, her future. The room fell into a heavy silence as Maria stood in the center, eyes locked with Greg's. He looked more disoriented than angry, a mix of confusion and guilt flashing across his face. Maria felt every gaze in the room sear into her skin, some curious, some judgmental, but all fixated on her. She could hear whispers start to ripple through the crowd. They must have been wondering who she was, what she was doing there, why she had decided to show up uninvited. Maria's heartbeat drummed in her ears, but she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't about them. This was about her. She had spent too long letting the world tell her who she was, letting Greg's betrayal define her. Today, she would take her power back. Greg took a hesitant step toward her, his face a mask of false politeness. "Maria, what are you doing here?" His voice was low, but the nervousness in it wasn't lost on her. She had always been able to read him well, and she could tell that this wasn't just a reunion he had been prepared for. He wasn't prepared for the reckoning she was about to deliver. "I came for closure, Greg," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "You took everything from me, and now I need you to understand what that did to me." A murmur passed through the guests, but Maria ignored it. This wasn't for them. It was for herself, for the woman she had become after losing everything to him. The betrayal, the broken promises, the years of living a lie. Greg's face hardened. He clearly hadn't expected her to be so direct. "Maria, don't make a scene. This is my wedding day," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough that everyone in the room could feel it. "No, Greg, this is about you," Maria said, stepping forward and not backing down. "This is about what you did to me and the lies you told. You left me homeless. You left me broken. And for what? To start a life with her." She gestured toward Cassandra, who was standing nearby, eyes wide in shock and confusion. "Do you really think that I'm just some casualty in your little game?" Greg's jaw clenched, but there was no denial in his eyes, just guilt. It was the look of a man who had spent far too long running from the truth, and now that truth was staring him in the face, louder than ever. Maria's voice grew stronger as she continued. "You betrayed me, Greg. You tore my life apart, and you didn't even have the decency to help me pick up the pieces. You left me with nothing. And you expect me to sit quietly while you play house with her." Cassandra stepped forward, trying to interrupt. "This isn't the time for this, Maria. You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling but sharp. But Maria wouldn't be silenced. "You think you've won, don't you?" She shot back, her eyes meeting Cassandra's. "You think you've taken my place, and that everything's going to be perfect. But let me tell you something. Nothing will ever be perfect with him. He's a liar, and you'll be nothing more than a placeholder until he finds someone new to betray." The room was now a mix of stunned faces and whispered conversations. Some guests looked uncomfortable, while others seemed genuinely shocked by the unfolding drama. Mariah felt a strange sense of power, as if the years of pain, the months of humiliation, had built up to this one moment where she could finally speak her truth. She didn't care who was watching anymore. She wasn't the woman who would shrink back in the corner anymore. She wasn't the woman who would apologize for existing in the wake of Greg's choices. "I'm not here for you, Greg," she said finally, turning away from him and addressing the room. "I'm here for me. I came to show you that no matter what you've done, I'm still standing. And you're still a liar, a cheater, and a coward." Greg's face turned red, and for a moment, it looked as though he might lash out. But he didn't. Instead, he stood there, fuming, powerless. It was as if the realization had hit him all at once. His past actions had caught up with him, and there was no escaping the fallout. His new bride, Cassandra, looked shaken, her face pale as she processed the weight of Mariah's words. The people around her began to murmur, their judgment clear, but it was too late for any of them to make a difference. Then, just when Mariah thought she had said everything, one of the wedding guests, an older woman with a kind face, approached her. The woman's voice was calm, but filled with empathy. "You shouldn't have to face this alone," she said, her hand gently resting on Mariah's arm. "You're welcome to stay with me, if you need somewhere to go." It was a simple offer, one that carried the weight of a world of kindness and understanding. For a moment, Maria was taken aback. She hadn't expected anyone, least of all someone at Greg's wedding, to show her such compassion. The gesture was small, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. It reminded her that not all people were like Greg. Not all people would take advantage of her or discard her when they were done. Some people still cared. The reality of the moment began to sink in. This wasn't just about confronting Greg. This wasn't just about confronting the past. It was about reclaiming her future, one choice at a time. She had been afraid to accept help for so long, but this woman's kindness was a reminder that there was still good in the world and that she wasn't beyond saving. Maria turned to Greg one last time, her voice softer but no less firm. "You'll never see me the way you did before. I'm done with you, but I'm not done with me." Greg stood there, motionless, his face a mixture of regret and frustration. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done, and Mariah had already made her peace with that. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else define who she was ever again. As Maria turned to walk away, she felt a sense of strength she hadn't felt in months. She was done with the past. The wedding, the betrayal, the pain, it was all behind her now. The future was unwritten, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance to write it on her own terms. The guests stared after her, some with pity, some with disbelief, but all with a newfound respect for the woman who had come to this wedding, not to reclaim a man, but to reclaim herself. And as she left the venue, the weight of the past seemed just a little lighter. And the path ahead, though uncertain, seemed full of possibility. The silence in the room hung heavily, almost suffocating, as Maria stepped away from Greg and Cassandra, her words still echoing in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. She could feel the eyes of the guests following her as she made her way toward the door, the weight of their gaze an invisible force pressing against her back. As she exited the wedding hall, the cool autumn air hit her face, refreshing and bracing. But it wasn't enough to shake the tension that lingered in her chest. Her heart still raced, and her hands trembled slightly, a mix of adrenaline and emotions she had been bottling up for so long. She had come here to find closure, to get answers, but all she had found was more chaos. It wasn't the perfect, neat ending she had hoped for, but maybe it was something better. Maybe it was the start of something new. Outside, the guests were still murmuring. The door opened just enough for Mariah to hear bits and pieces of their conversations. She knew they were talking about her, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. They didn't know her. They didn't know the life she had lived, the things she had endured. They couldn't possibly understand the pain that had led her to this moment. To them, she was an intruder, an anomaly in their perfect, privileged world. But to Mariah, this was her moment. It wasn't about them. It was about her. As she walked further into the cool evening, she allowed herself a deep breath. She hadn't expected this kind of fallout. She hadn't expected to feel so raw, so exposed. But as the minutes ticked by, something inside her began to shift. It was subtle at first, like a quiet, unspoken truth settling into her bones. She hadn't just confronted Greg. She had confronted herself. All the years of self-doubt, of wondering if she had been enough, if she was worth more than the betrayal that had shattered her life, came rushing to the surface. And in that moment, as she stood in the middle of the night with nothing but the cool air to keep her company, Mariah finally believed that she was. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, wondering who could be reaching out to her after the scene she just caused. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but decided, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, to answer. "Hello." Her voice was cautious, but there was an edge of curiosity in it. "Mariah." The voice on the other end was male, low and comforting, though she didn't recognize it. "This is Tony. I'm a friend of Greg's." Her immediate instinct was to hang up. Another person connected to Greg. Perhaps another person who felt the need to judge her or lecture her. But something about his voice stopped her. "I know what you did back there," he continued. "And I just want you to know, I respect it. What you said about standing up for yourself, it's something I wish more people had the guts to do. Greg isn't a good man, not like he wants everyone to believe." Maria was taken aback. She had no idea who this Tony was or what he wanted, but his words felt like a balm to her wounded pride. "You know him?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "Yes," Tony said. "I've known Greg for a long time. We used to work together, but I've seen what kind of person he is. You're right about him. He's manipulative, selfish. He's done this before, to other people. And I can tell you right now, he's not going to be the person he pretends to be in front of you, or anyone else." Maria let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "So you're telling me this because you think I should feel better about what happened back there?" she asked, her voice thick with the weight of the conversation. The silence in the room hung heavily, almost suffocating, as Maria stepped away from Greg and Cassandra, her words still echoing in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. She could feel the eyes of the guests following her as she made her way toward the door, the weight of their gaze an invisible force pressing against her back. As she exited the wedding hall, the cool autumn air hit her face, refreshing and bracing. But it wasn't enough to shake the tension that lingered in her chest. Her heart still raced, and her hands trembled slightly, a mix of adrenaline and emotions she had been bottling up for so long. She had come here to find closure, to get answers, but all she had found was more chaos. It wasn't the perfect, neat ending she had hoped for, but maybe it was something better. Maybe it was the start of something new. Outside, the guests were still murmuring. The door opened just enough for Mariah to hear bits and pieces of their conversations. She knew they were talking about her, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. They didn't know her. They didn't know the life she had lived, the things she had endured. They couldn't possibly understand the pain that had led her to this moment. To them, she was an intruder, an anomaly in their perfect, privileged world. But to Mariah, this was her moment. It wasn't about them. It was about her. As she walked further into the cool evening, she allowed herself a deep breath. She hadn't expected this kind of fallout. She hadn't expected to feel so raw, so exposed. But as the minutes ticked by, something inside her began to shift. It was subtle at first, like a quiet, unspoken truth settling into her bones. She hadn't just confronted Greg. She had confronted herself. All the years of self-doubt, of wondering if she had been enough, if she was worth more than the betrayal that had shattered her life, came rushing to the surface. And in that moment, as she stood in the middle of the night with nothing but the cool air to keep her company, Maria finally believed that she was. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, wondering who could be reaching out to her after the scene she just caused. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. She almost ignored it but decided, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, to answer. "Hello." Her voice was cautious, but there was an edge of curiosity in it. "Maria." The voice on the other end was male, low and comforting, though she didn't recognize it. "This is Tony. I'm a friend of Greg's." Her immediate instinct was to hang up. Another person connected to Greg. Perhaps another person who felt the need to judge her or lecture her. But something about his voice stopped her. "I know what you did back there," he continued. "And I just want you to know, I respect it. What you said about standing up for yourself, it's something I wish more people had the guts to do. Greg isn't a good man, not like he wants everyone to believe." Maria was taken aback. She had no idea who this Tony was or what he wanted, but his words felt like a balm to her wounded pride. "You know him?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "Yes," Tony said. "I've known Greg for a long time. We used to work together, but I've seen what kind of person he is. You're right about him. He's manipulative, selfish. He's done this before, to other people. And I can tell you right now, he's not going to be the person he pretends to be in front of you or anyone else." Maria let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "So you're telling me this because you think I should feel better about what happened back there?" she asked, her voice thick with the weight of the conversation. Tony chuckled softly, a warm sound that eased some of the tension in Maria's shoulders. "Not exactly. I just think you deserve better than what Greg ever gave you, and maybe I can help you get that better life you've been fighting for. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I can offer you a chance to start over. You don't have to do it alone." Maria paused. There was something in Tony's voice, something genuine that she hadn't heard in a long time. Tony chuckled softly, a warm sound that eased some of the tension in Maria's shoulders. "Not exactly. I just think you deserve better than what Greg ever gave you, and maybe I can help you get that better life you've been fighting for. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I can offer you a chance to start over. You don't have to do it alone." Maria paused. There was something in Tony's voice, something genuine that she hadn't heard in a long time. She had grown so used to people letting her down, to people walking the next few days felt like a blur for Maria. After the wedding, she spent hours pacing her small apartment, the weight of her emotions shifting with every passing thought. She had left that wedding feeling raw and vulnerable, yet somehow there was a glimmer of hope beginning to take root inside her. Tony's offer to help her start over had echoed in her mind, a possibility that seemed too good to be true. She couldn't deny that she was skeptical. Trust had been a luxury she hadn't been able to afford in years. People always let her down. Greg had proved that. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to take that leap of faith again. But the thought of staying stuck, of continuing to fight battles alone, was wearing her down. After another sleepless night, she decided to follow through. She sent Tony a message, asking for more details about what he was offering. He replied almost immediately, with the location of his luxury apartment and a few instructions. He assured her that there would be no pressure, that she could take her time deciding what she wanted to do. Maria stood in front of the bathroom mirror that morning, staring at her reflection. It was the same woman who had been to that wedding, broken, uncertain, hesitant. But there was a subtle difference now. In the past few days, she had allowed herself to acknowledge that she was worth more than what she had been through. It was as if, in confronting Greg, she had confronted herself too. She wasn't the woman who had lost everything anymore. She was someone who had begun to rebuild, even if the foundation felt shaky. She grabbed her things, not knowing what to expect, but feeling as if something had finally shifted. When she arrived at Tony's apartment, she couldn't help but be struck by the stark contrast between it and the life she had been living. The building was sleek, modern, with the kind of luxury that seemed like it belonged to a different world. It almost intimidated her at first. She had spent years struggling to get by, never imagining that she could be standing in a place like this. Yet, despite her discomfort, she knew that it was a step, a bold one, towards something better. Tony greeted her at the door, a warm smile on his face, his presence somehow immediately calming. He was tall, well-dressed, and exuded an aura of success, but it wasn't the kind of success that made him seem untouchable. There was a genuine kindness about him that put Mariah at ease. "I'm glad you came," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The apartment was everything she had imagined it would be. Clean lines, spacious, bathed in natural light. Mariah felt a wave of unfamiliar comfort wash over her, but it was quickly followed by a sharp pang of guilt. What was she doing here? Was she really about to let this stranger help her? What if this was just another mistake? But Tony's calm demeanor seemed to erase her doubts, at least for a moment. He led her into the living room, offering her a seat. "I know this must feel overwhelming," he said, taking a seat across from her. "I'm not asking for anything in return. You don't have to rush into anything. I just want you to feel safe here." Maria nodded, still unsure of what to say. The silence between them hung in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if Tony understood that she needed time to process, to make sense of everything that had brought her here. She realized that, in this space, she had the luxury of taking her time. There was no rush to make decisions, no pressure to perform, no expectations. "What exactly is it that you want from me?" Mariah finally asked, cutting through the tension that had built up in her chest. She needed clarity. She needed to understand why he was offering his help and what he stood to gain from it. Tony leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "I want you to have a chance at something better. You don't deserve to live in the shadows of the life Greg left behind. You've been through hell, and I think you deserve more than just surviving. You deserve a life that's yours, something built on your own terms, not someone else's." Mariah blinked, taken aback by his words. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, especially not a man who had no obligation to her. His sincerity was disarming, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Mariah allowed herself to imagine a future beyond just getting by. Could it be possible? Could she really start over, build something new? And if so, where would she begin? "I don't know if I'm ready," Mariah said quietly, the weight of her own uncertainty bearing down on her. "I've been on my own for so long. I don't know how to trust people anymore. What if I fail? What if I screw this up?" Tony's gaze softened, and he leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to have everything figured out right now. And you won't fail. Not if you give yourself the chance to try. Starting over is scary, but it's also freeing. You've already taken the hardest step by coming here. The rest will come, one piece at a time." Maria looked at him, her chest tightening with emotions she didn't know how to articulate. She had spent so long protecting herself, hiding behind walls of pride and fear, that she had forgotten what it was like to trust, to believe in the kindness of others. And yet here was Tony, offering a lifeline, not because he expected anything in return, but because he saw potential in her that she had long since lost sight of. In that moment, something shifted inside Mariah. The part of her that had always been scared, the part that had believed she wasn't worthy of help, began to soften. She had spent so much time trying to prove her worth to others, to show that she was strong enough to survive on her own. But maybe it was time to stop proving herself and start living for herself. Maybe it was time to take a chance. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust again," Mariah said slowly, her voice wavering with the truth of it. "But I want to try. I want to see where this goes." Tony smiled, and for the first time in a long time, Mariah allowed herself to smile back. It wasn't much, But it was enough. It was the beginning of something new. A new chapter she had no idea how to write, but one she was finally willing to embrace. The past would always be with her in some way, but it no longer had to define her. She had a chance now, a real chance, to build something different. The fear, the uncertainty, and the pain didn't vanish overnight, but for the first time, Mariah felt like she was no longer alone in the struggle. "I'll help you," Tony said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll take this one day at a time, together." Mariah nodded, the weight on her shoulders feeling just a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could be different. Away when the going got tough. And here was someone, a stranger, offering her a hand when she was at her lowest. She was torn between skepticism and hope. "And what do you want in return?" she asked. "I'm not asking for anything in return," Tony said quickly. "I just think you've been dealt a bad hand, and it's time you had a shot at something real. You've been through hell, and you deserve the opportunity to rebuild." Mariah stared down at her feet, the decision hanging in the air like a heavy weight. She had always prided herself on being strong enough to do everything on her own. She had made it this far, hadn't she? But the truth was, she was tired. Tired of fighting alone. Tired of always being the one to pick up the pieces. And the more she thought about Tony's offer, the more she realized that maybe it was time to accept help. She didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. Maybe it was time to let someone else carry it with her. "I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I'm willing to listen," she said finally, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "Good," Tony said with a sense of finality in his voice. "I'll send you the details of where I am. If you decide to come, I'll be waiting." As she ended the call, Mariah stood in the stillness of the night, the weight of the decision slowly settling on her shoulders. She didn't know where this would lead, or if Tony was even sincere. But one thing was clear, her life had just taken a turn. The path ahead wasn't paved with certainty, but maybe that was the point. She had always been afraid of what would happen if she let go of control, if she allowed herself to trust again. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she was ready to take that leap. She didn't look back as she walked away from the wedding. Instead, she looked forward, toward the unknown, toward the possibility of a future she had long since stopped believing in. The road ahead would be hard, and it would take everything she had to rebuild what had been shattered. But this time, she wouldn't be doing it alone. And that, for now, was enough to keep her moving forward. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change, each moment pushing Mariah further out of her comfort zone and into a life that was beginning to feel like something worth fighting for. The apartment Tony had offered her wasn't just a place to sleep. It became a sanctuary, a place where she could finally breathe without the constant pressure of survival. For the first time in months, she could wake up without fear, without wondering where her next meal would come from or where she would sleep that night. Tony's kindness wasn't just in offering her a roof over her head. It was in the small things, too. He didn't treat her like a charity case. He didn't patronize her or make her feel indebted. He simply treated her with respect, as an equal, as someone worthy of a fresh start. Mariah began to let her guard down, just a little. She started going out, running errands, visiting the local coffee shops, and trying to reconnect with the world outside of the shadows where she had spent so long. Tony helped her get her resume together, and together they started working on rebuilding her professional life. He wasn't just offering her a place to stay. He was helping her see a future where she wasn't just surviving, but thriving. But with every step forward came a lingering fear. Mariah had always been good at pretending she was okay, at hiding her vulnerabilities behind a mask of strength. But now, with the distance from her old life, she couldn't ignore the deeper wounds that still festered beneath the surface. The betrayal by Greg still haunted her, especially in her quieter moments when her thoughts turned inward. She had spent so much of her life wrapped up in his lies that letting go of them felt like an impossible task. The damage Greg had caused wasn't just external. It was deep, internal, and for the first time, Maria was forced to confront how much of her self-worth had been tied to his approval. One afternoon, after a long day of job hunting, Maria sat in the living room, her laptop open but her mind elsewhere. She hadn't heard from Greg in weeks, but suddenly, his name popped up on her phone screen. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to erase him from her life once and for all. But another part of her, the part that still had unanswered questions, couldn't help but answer. "Hello." Her voice trembled, though she tried to hide it. "Maria." Greg's voice was calm, too calm, as if everything that had happened had been forgotten. "I think it's time we talked." Maria felt the old pang of anger flare up inside her. She hadn't expected to hear from him, and part of her was angry that he thought he could just waltz back into her life. But she was also surprised by how little of a reaction it stirred in her. When he had left her, his absence had felt like a giant hole in her world. But now, weeks removed from the heartbreak, that hole had begun to heal. She was no longer the woman she had been when he walked out. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about, Greg," Maria said, her voice steady. She wasn't the scared, broken woman from before. She was stronger now, and she wasn't going to let him back into her life so easily. "I didn't mean for things to end the way they did," Greg continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been bottling up guilt. "I've been thinking about it, and I realize now that I hurt you more than I thought. I'm sorry." Maria's breath caught in her throat. The words were exactly what she had longed to hear when everything fell apart. But now, they felt hollow, empty. The apology she had once yearned for no longer had the power to bring her comfort. It was too little, too late. Her silence hung between them, and in that silence, she realized something profound. She had already forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own. She had released the anger, the resentment, because holding on to it had only kept her stuck in the past. She had finally given herself permission to move forward. "You don't get to fix this, Greg," she said softly. "You don't get to undo the damage you caused. But I'm okay now. I've found a way to move on. And you don't get to be part of that anymore." The line was quiet for a long moment. Maria felt a sense of finality, of peace in that silence. There were no more questions, no more feelings of being incomplete. She had spoken her truth, and in doing so, had closed the door on the past. It was over. Greg was no longer the anchor that held her to her old life. She had untethered herself from him, from the pain he had caused, and she felt lighter, freer than she ever had before. After hanging up, Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing. She had taken control of her life. She wasn't waiting for someone else to fix it anymore. She wasn't waiting for Greg or anyone else to give her permission to move on. She was the one who had to choose her future, and for the first time in a long time, she was choosing herself. It was a few days later when Tony suggested she attend a networking event with him, a casual gathering of professionals in the area who were interested in business, philanthropy, and the arts. Maria hesitated. She had always shied away from situations like that, afraid of not fitting in, of being judged for her past. But Tony insisted, telling her that the event was about making connections, about taking small steps toward a new future. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about showing up. With a deep breath, Maria agreed. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror that night, trying on the clothes Tony had helped her pick out. A simple yet elegant outfit that made her feel confident, powerful even. It wasn't the same woman who had attended Greg's wedding, still broken and searching for answers. This was a woman who knew her worth, who understood that her past didn't define her. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. And that night, she was ready to take another step toward the life she had always dreamed of. The event turned out to be everything Tony had promised. It was informal but filled with people who were eager to share their ideas and experiences. For the first time in ages, Maria felt like she belonged. She had a conversation with a woman who worked in a nonprofit organization, a man who ran a small tech company, and several others who were passionate about making a difference. She didn't know where it would lead, but she felt a spark of possibility ignite inside her. This was what she had been waiting for, not just a chance at survival, but a chance to build something meaningful, something that was hers and hers alone. By the end of the night, Maria was exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time, she wasn't looking back at the wreckage of her past. She was looking forward to the future, her future, and it felt like anything was possible. She wasn't sure exactly where this path would lead, but she knew she was no longer walking it alone. With Tony's support and her own growing confidence, Maria had begun to carve out a new life for herself, one step at a time. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of hope, and that hope was enough to keep her moving forward. The weeks passed, and Maria found herself in a rhythm she hadn't known was possible just a few months ago. With each day, the weight of her past seemed lighter, and the future brighter. Tony had kept his promise, guiding her through the process of rebuilding her life. Step by step, his unwavering support had helped her regain the confidence that had once been lost in the wreckage of her marriage. But it was more than just his help that had sparked her transformation. It was the quiet strength that had always existed within her, buried under layers of self-doubt and pain. She had only needed to learn how to trust herself again. Maria had started working part-time at a local nonprofit, helping organize events for underprivileged children. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was fulfilling, and it gave her a sense of purpose that she hadn't known she needed. She was doing something meaningful, something that helped others, and in turn, helped her heal. She no longer felt like an outsider in a world she didn't belong to. She had found her place, not just in Tony's world, but in the world at large. It was a feeling she'd almost forgotten, but now it consumed her. However, even as she built this new life, there were moments where her old insecurities crept in, where the shadows of her past loomed large. Every so often, she would think about Greg and the years she had spent trying to prove her worth to him. She would wonder if he was thinking about her, if he was regretting what he had done. But each time, the thought was fleeting, like a cloud passing across the sky. Maria had learned that regret, though powerful, was not her burden to carry. She had nothing to prove to him or to anyone else. One evening, as Maria was leaving work, she received a call. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. Hesitantly, she answered, "Maria." The voice on the other end was familiar, though she hadn't heard it in weeks. It was Greg. "Greg," she said, the word almost foreign on her lips. "What do you want?" I need to talk to you. Can we meet?" "It's important," he said, his voice strained, almost desperate. Maria felt a wave of annoyance wash over her. She had worked so hard to move on from him, to leave him and his lies behind. But his voice, tinged with an unfamiliar urgency, tugged at something inside her. "Why now, Greg?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. "Why do you need to talk to me after everything?" "I know I messed up," he began, his tone almost pleading. "But this isn't about me. It's about you, Maria. I've seen you change. I've heard things. People are talking, and I think you deserve to know the truth." Maria's heart raced. "The truth about what?" He paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "I've been trying to make things right, but I need you to hear it from me. It's about something that happened at the wedding. Something you didn't know." Maria's stomach churned. What could he possibly say now that could change anything? The man who had destroyed her life was now trying to play the role of someone with important information. Her instinct was to hang up, to end the conversation right there. But a part of her, a part that couldn't quite let go, felt the pull of his words. It was as if something inside her knew she needed to hear whatever it was he had to say. "Fine," she said, finally giving in, though her voice was cold. "I'll meet you. But this better be good, Greg." They agreed to meet at a coffee shop in the morning. Maria arrived early, her nerves on edge as she waited at a small table near the window. She hadn't seen Greg in person since that chaotic wedding, and the idea of facing him again made her stomach twist. But she was no longer the same woman who had walked away from him years ago. She wasn't the woman who had clung to the hope that he would change. She had moved on. She had healed. And now, meeting him again felt like nothing more than a formality. When Greg arrived, he looked tired, older, perhaps, but still wearing the mask of someone who was trying to appear composed. He hesitated for a moment when he saw her, but then sat down across from her. The silence between them felt thick, almost suffocating. "Maria, I don't know how to say this," Greg started, his voice wavering slightly. "But I need to come clean about something that happened the day of the wedding." Maria's eyes narrowed. "What happened, Greg?" He hesitated again, clearly struggling with the weight of what he was about to say. "That woman you spoke to, Cassandra, she wasn't the first person I'd heard. I wasn't honest with you, Maria. The reason I left you, the reason I walked away, it wasn't just about the affair. There were things I did, things I didn't tell you about. I've been carrying the guilt for so long, but I don't know how to make it right." Maria felt her heart rate quicken, a sense of dread building in her chest. Was this some twisted attempt at redemption? Or was he just trying to absolve himself of his sins, to relieve the burden of his guilt? "You need to be more specific, Greg," she said, her voice firm but filled with quiet anger. "What are you talking about?" He leaned forward, looking as if he were about to say something monumental. "When I left you, it wasn't just about Cassandra. There were things I did that I thought I could bury, secrets, lies, things that affected not just our marriage, but other people too. I took something from you that you didn't even know about." Maria felt her breath catch. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempts to keep her composure. Greg took a deep breath. "I'm saying that the reason I left you wasn't just because of what happened between us. It's because I knew what I had done to you wasn't just about an affair. I'd been keeping secrets about our finances, about the way I manipulated things behind your back. You had no idea, Maria, but you should have known. You deserved the truth." The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. All this time, she had thought the betrayal was simple, an affair, a broken marriage. But now, Greg was confessing to something deeper, something far more insidious. He had undermined her, taken control of their life in ways she couldn't have imagined. She felt sick. This was the final blow. He wasn't just a liar. He had been a thief, taking things she had worked for and never even telling her. For a long moment, Maria sat in stunned silence, processing the weight of Greg's confession. Then she stood up, her voice low but resolute. "I don't need you to fix this, Greg. You can't fix it. What you did to me, to us, is irreversible. You don't get to come back into my life and undo all the damage you caused." Greg looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret, but it was too late. "I know," he said quietly. "I didn't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth." Maria turned away, the weight of the conversation sinking deep into her bones. But as she stepped out of the coffee shop, a strange sense of peace began to settle over her. This was the final chapter in the story of her past with Greg. She had spent so much time trying to understand what had happened, trying to make sense of his betrayal, but now she knew. She understood it all. And for the first time, she realized that she didn't need to carry the weight of it anymore. Maria walked away from the coffee shop, leaving Greg and the past behind her for good. The future, now fully in her hands, was hers to shape, and as the sun set behind her, she felt the first real sense of freedom she had known in years. She had come full circle. She had faced her demons, forgiven herself, and reclaimed the life that had always been hers to live. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid.